Welcome to Newton Conservators webinar series for the spring of 2022. We're delighted to have Annise Dobson as our third presenter this season. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be the moderator of this virtual event, and Barbara Bates is our technical director. As most of you probably already know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961 that works to preserve and to maintain open space in Newton. For more information about the organization, check out our website at newtonconservators.org. New members get a trail guide as a welcome gift, and we'd love to have you become a member. Newton Conservators acknowledges that Newton and the open spaces that we promote and steward are located on the traditional, contemporary, and unceded territories of the Massachusetts. We acknowledge that Massachusetts' stewardship of this land kept its ecological communities vibrant, strong, and interconnected for thousands of years. Newton Conservators hopes to build authentic relationships with the Massachusetts, and we recognize that there is much work to be done here. Our simple land acknowledgement is only an imperfect first step. In tonight's presentation, Annise will present the impacts and history of earthworms and jumping worms in particular, and will provide information on identification of jumping worms. Dr. Annise Dobson grew up on a farm in Ottawa Valley in Ontario, Canada. After completing her PhD at Cornell, she began a position as a postdoctoral researcher at the Yale School of Environment. Her research focuses on the impacts of jumping worms, white-tailed deer, and other stressors to native plant communities in northeastern Canada and the United States. Currently, she's working to identify the movement of jumping worms through New York City and assessing their impacts on urban plant communities. We look forward to having her help us to assess the impact of jumping worms on our plant communities. Welcome, Annise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fantastic to be here with you virtually. Thanks for the introduction, Beth. So I'll skip the intro of myself. One thing that you mentioned that I really appreciate is that I grew up on a farm, and that's informed a lot of the research that I like to do. And so on this farm, as I'm sure similar to many of you, you thought about earthworms as being generally good for the environment, good for the soil, good for the plants, just good all around. And so it was really exciting to me to start thinking about the other things that earthworms could be doing, and to start to consider that the same traits that make them so good in some contexts, in farms, can make them so destructive in other contexts. So I want you to consider, when you're thinking about earthworms in the environment, and you're asking this question, are earthworms good? I get asked this question a lot. So before you ask it, I'm going to help you prompt to think about how to answer it. So the first thing to think about is that not all habitats are the same. So this is a picture from my family farm here. That's my mom in her vegetable field with perfectly straight lines and no weeds. Mine does not look like that. And then over here, there is the woods that's right next door. So these habitats are really different. On the left, these plants are growing in soil that's plowed regularly. And the plants that you put in there are going to be fast-growing annuals that we've selected to grow quickly and take advantage of nutrients coming in really quickly. And if the plant doesn't have exactly what it needs, what it wants, you can always amend the soil with fertilizer. You can change the pH. There's a lot you can do to make the microhabitat just right for that plant. Natural plants, on the other hand, growing in natural communities, they're experiencing a really different habitat. So the soil gets mixed really slowly, generally with fungi historically. And the species that are growing there tend to be slow-growing perennials. So in my PhD, one of the species that I looked at were wild leeks, ramps that are out there now. And I did my master's and my PhD, so that was 7.5, almost 8 years. And the seeds that I had planted had maximum 2 leaves after all of that time. So these things growing in the forest around us here in Connecticut, they can be really, really old and really, really small. They grow really slowly. And we can't amend the soil necessarily around them to give them exactly what they want. So they've evolved different ways of relying on the rest of their community, like symbiotic fungi, like ants to move their seeds around, and other things like that. Okay, so not all habitats are the same. That's the first thing. The second one is that not all plants need the same thing. So two of the big species that I study in New York City, one of the most common plants in New York City, this is poison ivy over here, and a pretty common plant still over here that is the false Solomon seal. It's much slower growing. So the poison ivy, characteristics of that, it grows quickly. It has a lot of flexibility in how it grows. So it can, of course, grow up trees, grow on the ground, become sort of a woody bush. And it can grow in, yeah, it has a lot of flexibility based on the environment it's living in. And they can seek out microhabitats. So as it cruises along the top of the soil, it can just drop little roots into little microhabitats that are ideal for it. So it can cover a lot of ground and look for what exactly it needs. Over here, we've got false Solomon seal. That's one of those slow growing native perennials that's really dependent on mutualists like mycorrhizal fungi to get nutrients, to get water. And a lot of the plants that we love, the trilliums, the wild leeks, the false Solomon seal, all of those herbaceous understory plants, as well as a lot of the trees that our economy relies on and that we love for all sorts of reasons, they've evolved to live in the duff. So the duff is the organic, spongy stuff on the top of the soil. Okay, third question to ask yourself is whether or not all worms are the same. So I'm going to mainly be talking about jumping worms. We've also got the European worms that have been here for quite a lot longer that you're probably quite familiar with. But there's also a small number of native worms in some unique habitats around Connecticut. So here in Woodbridge, Connecticut, where I live, we've actually got two native species. But they're kind of hard to find because they're found in wetland areas, which is not typically where you look for earthworms. All right, so with that primer, we're gonna move into part one. All right, so this picture here is in the blue. This is where the last ice sheet approximately covered. And so the idea is if there were any earthworms up here in Connecticut, they were knocked out by the glacier, and they've been really, really slow to recolonize from below here. It's been estimated they recolonize about 10 meters a year on their own. So very, very slow to get back. And so the forests that we have here in Connecticut, they evolved, the plant community evolved in the absence of earthworms here. And so the present day communities that you see are going to be almost entirely not native unless you go digging for worms in bogs and wetlands. And this is happening all over the world. There's a small number, about 3% of the 7,000 or so earthworms out there that are really good at colonizing different habitats. So small number of earthworms are moving into tropical areas and temperate areas. And so someone that I don't remember who did coined it global worming. This idea that there's some worms that are homogeneously moving all across big swaths of the world. And so this tends to be three different things. So you're displacing native earthworms, and this is common in places like Australia that have some pretty wacky earthworm community, like this giant Gippsland earthworm here, or this royal blue one right over here. In Connecticut, it's more of the other two, though. It's more displacing existing invasions of European species, like this Nightcrawler right here, and invading into earthworm-free regions. We have a lot of areas that aren't colonized by the European species that the jumping worms do manage to make their way into. So why this is important is not the worms themselves, but what they do to the ecosystem. So over here on the left, this is a historical Connecticut forest. And I mentioned duff, that a lot of things evolved to live in. So the way that that's built up is that the nutrients that are, or the leaves that are falling, build up more on the forest floor than what's used up, than what's decomposed. And so you get this really stratified soil profile. And up here in the top, that spongy duff layer is a really, really good habitat for the plants that I mentioned, but also lots of invertebrates, including ticks, but some other things that we love, like springtails and millipedes and things like that. And also vertebrates like salamanders, they kind of rely on that duff layer as well. And so earthworms, invasive earthworms, in this case, either the lumbricid European ones or the newer jumping worms that are coming in now, they speed up that decomposition. They homogenize things, they mix things up, they eat everything really quickly, so you no longer have that buildup, that spongy forest floor duff buildup on top. And then that whole microhabitat is missing. And so everything that relies on that can be negatively affected. So this is what the real life version of that cartoon looks like. Here on the left, this is historical forest with this spongy duff. And if you look really close, you can see some roots, some fungal hyphae, all sorts of complexity in there. Versus here, my hand is where that duff would be, but it's been decomposed and mixed in by the earthworm. So this looks a lot more like a garden soil. So lumbricids, this is the Nightcrawler and some of its relatives. These are the first wave of earthworms that have been here for probably hundreds of years. We don't really know when they came here. People weren't really paying attention to them for a long time. But there's the classic Nightcrawler that maybe you've used for fishing. The red wiggler, this is the composting worm. They're pretty sensitive to cold, and they kind of stick close to compost piles, and they can't really get out and survive the winter. So these guys, if you want to have a worm bin, make sure that this is what you got. These ones are great. And then gray worms, these are a complex of species that you will often see stranded on the sidewalk after a rainstorm, which, fun fact, is not because they can't swim. They can survive underwater. It's because they come up when it's wet to migrate, and in some species to mate. But then they migrate and then they get stuck on the pavement and can't get back down. But if you're trying to keep worms out with water, that's not going to work, I learned early on. So the second wave of earthworms after those lumbricids are a group of species that we call jumping worms. And the interesting thing about this is that they have a bunch of names. And that's not a coincidence. They have this whole long list of names because it was a problem that people in all different parts of the country recognized and started to think about, but there was no real, everyone, all the scientists were like, no, earthworms are good. And it was gardeners, managers, people working on the ground that noticed this problem. So now we've got this issue where there's a whole bunch of names of different things. So people were like, I don't have jumping worms, I have snake worms. I don't have snake worms, I have crazy worms. I'm trying to get people to sort of agree on jumping worms because I think that's quite descriptive. So what I want you to look at here in this picture is that you've got light gray up here and dark gray up here, right? So that's a key thing to look at. These little points are where jumping worms have been found, have been reported. And what's really interesting here is that this dark gray is where jumping worms could move to based on their thermal tolerance. So they are resistant enough to cold to get up here into northern Ontario, really close to Hudson's Bay. So they're not really tamped down by cold winters. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And they have the possibility to spread really, really long distances. So quick ways that they're behaving differently in the soil. They're approximately the same size when they're mature. They're both quite big. But jumping worms get to a very high density. They mature really, really quickly. They're annual, so they reproduce, by around July, they'll be starting to be reproductive. And then the last thing is that they're parthenogenetic. So they don't need to find another earthworm to mate with. They can just lay eggs with their cocoons that are just essentially clones of themselves. The Nightcrawler here, these ones get to much lower densities. You'll only find a few in a meter square patch usually, at least the Nightcrawlers. And they're much slower to maturity. So they live for multiple years. 3 to 5 years is what I've seen. I've heard a rumor that they can live up to 20 years from a credible source, but I haven't seen it with my own eyes. So take that with a grain of salt. And they are hermaphroditic. So they've got both male and female parts, but they need to find another earthworm to mate with to produce offspring. And this is probably the point in the talk where you start thinking, okay, what do the jumping worms look like in their native range? What do those forests look like? And their forests actually look a lot like our forests. The jumping worm species that we have here are not in their forests. They're restricted to ditches and really disturbed areas in along the roadside, but they don't move into the forest. And we don't know exactly why that is. There's a whole bunch of possible answers, but the number one hypothesis that I like is that there's a huge diversity of other jumping worm species in the forest. So there's a lot of niche specification, a lot of competition potentially. And that means that no one earthworm can really proliferate too much. So they do still have some duff and do have a diverse, fairly diverse understory plant community. So if we're thinking about jumping worms specifically, this is a picture of just generally what earthworms do. With jumping worms, what you're going to see is a thick layer of castings that can be 2 inches deep. If it's at the bottom of a slope, it can be 15 inches deep. It can get quite deep, but the jumping worms are living right on the surface. And what does this mean? A lot of the changes are all mediated by how they change soil. So they turn it into this really granular soil that I have seen described in a number of ways. So you can decide which one of these you like best. So coffee grounds, I've heard ground turkey or ground beef. And then the one that I just heard recently is nerd candy. If you've ever had those, this kind of looks like a handful of nerd candy, just brown. And it's really, really unstable. So they're big chunks, kind of gravelly, like the size of gravel, but they don't adhere very well to each other. And so what this means is that you get a ton of erosion. And this is how I got into studying jumping worms. I was looking at white-tailed deer. We had fences up on a slope, and that deer fence would collect all of the castings as they were brought down the hill. And it was super deep there. And it was very, very easy to see the erosion that could potentially be getting into the waterways.
Annise, can you remind everyone what castings are, please?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the castings are the poop that comes out the other side.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to play you a little video of what that soil looks like in my very sad strawberry garden. We've got tons of jumping worms. So what I want you to be looking at here is the texture of the soil. Yeah, what's going on with the soil. So you see there kind of these gravelly beads, super easy to dig to. And what this means for plants, imagine a plant trying to grow in gravel instead of soil, that it's going to dry out really, really easily. So you get low germination of new seedlings, you get drying out of existing seedlings, and you get really unstable rooting. So plants just toppling over. You can pull them out. You don't even have to dig a hole to dig the plants out. You just pull them out really, really easily because it's so unstable. And so this is what the casting looks like here too, a different soil. And what this plays out as on the landscape is a real strong influence on the ratio of native to non-native plants. So this is from a big study that was led by Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City Parks, covering the 5 boroughs of New York City. 1,200 plots. It's a really, really huge study. And they just made some sort of field notes about these weird castings that they saw on the ground. They weren't out to study earthworms, but they made the note of it. And so I was able to use that data, even though they didn't really have a plan for it in the first place. So this is kind of a reason you should be taking ample field notes when you're out, because you never know when they'll come in handy. But what I want you to look at here is the percent cover of native plants. So things like our false Solomon seal here. And this is the human impact. So this is a combination of a whole bunch of other things like trails and trash and all of these things, but this is less important. You could think of it as sort of, human disturbance on the landscape, which is actually not that important in this case. But what is really important is the distance between these two lines, right? So when we're talking about percent cover of native plants, without jumping worms, you're getting about 25% cover of native plants. And remember, this is in New York City, so there are a lot of invasive plants. But still quite a few native plants without jumping worms. Now in the plots with jumping worms, that number crashes down to about 10% native plant cover when you're looking down at the soil. Invasive plants, it's the opposite. So you get more than 50% invasive plants in the jumping worm invaded plots. And when you don't have jumping worms, you get closer to 30% invasive plant cover. So that's like what you actually, the green stuff that you see on the ground. But another thing that we measure is the diversity. So the number of different species that we've got. And one way we measure this is with richness. So this is just counting up the number of species in a small plot. And on average, when you have jumping worms, the native species, you only have about one native species in each plot. Without jumping worms, it bumps up to about over 2. What is kind of interesting is you see a pretty similar pattern with invasive species. So jumping worms are also bad for the diversity of invasive species. So I think what they're doing is they're generally pretty bad for most plants, even non-native plants, even invasive plants, but they're just worse for native plants. All right. So we're going to go and talk about a few of the native plants that we've got, because remember, our second question or our second thought is that not all plants need the same thing. So 2 native species that tend to do really well with jumping worms are, of course, the poison ivy. You can see here that that you have the large main root and the stolons right along the surface, so they can cruise out and find what they need and drop the roots in. So if they are in a really stressful, dried out place, they can go try and, put a root in elsewhere. Johnny Jumpseed is another one that's pretty common throughout Connecticut. It's very cool when it's ripe, the seeds kind of jump off the stem, but it also can reproduce in other ways. So the stem grows up quite tall, and then if it topples over, that stem has the ability to turn into to essentially root. So roots can come off that stem. So if it topples over, that's fine. It just is kind of walking as it topples over. So they can even benefit from jumping worms in a lot of ways. But a lot of our native species have these interesting root structures, right? Remember I told you they can be decades old. They live for a long time, and they don't have a wide network of roots, but they have one big root organ. And this is really important from year to year, that they store up their energy in there. So if you get eaten by a deer, let's say, that's okay. Your flower's gone, your leaves are gone, but you've got all this energy saved up, so you can try again next year, try again the year after that. But when you get the stress coming from above from the deer and below from the jumping worms, then that's where you start to see some big problems. And that is exactly what I see in New York City. So a lot of the species can survive growing with jumping worms or survive being around deer. And when I say survive being around high deer numbers, I mean they kind of grow one leaf and they stay really small. They're not these big, beautiful reproductive plants. But when you have both of these things happening at the same time, you see local extinctions of native plants. So they have built-in ways to deal with some stressors, but when the stressors pile up, there's a breaking point. And so with working with plants, this is what I think about a lot. And spoiler for the end, there aren't a lot of great solutions for getting rid of jumping worms in natural areas once they've established. And so I think about what kind of things you can do to restore species or grow species in your garden that will still survive. And so we're doing some big data analysis where you can try and get at some plant traits that might benefit from jumping worms or might survive with jumping worms. But what's been more successful up to this point has actually been just random, weird natural history things that come from just being out in the woods and learning about these different plants. So we've got Jack in the Pulpit that has a lot of chemical defenses to help it not get eaten by deer, not get eaten by worms, keep the worms away. Trout lilies that have the ability to sort of pull themselves back in to the soil if the duff layer erodes from around them. And Christmas fern, I don't really know what they're doing, but they seem to be doing okay with jumping worms. And of course, if you're affecting the plant community, there's a lot of things that depend upon the plant community. So what I've told you so far is that jumping worms benefit invasive plants and negatively affect native plants. And this has consequences for things like birds. So if plants aren't your cup of tea, you can worry about the birds. So this is a number of ways. One way is that invasive plants tend to be not that nutritious for birds. And things like this ground nesting bird here, they rely on some of those native plants to hide their nests, and they need the duff layer to actually nest into. And so all of these things combined can be pretty negative for a lot of birds. All right, now other things that happen when you lose the duff layer is that you're losing all of the things growing in there. So the millipedes, also the ticks, but a lot of the things that we love, this big rich community of soil arthropods and soil animals, but also things like salamanders that need temperature cues to know when to come up and to mate. And when jumping worms come in, they totally mess with the temperature, with the way that with the soil temperature. Let's just say that. And so what happens when you lose the native millipedes? In addition, all of the things that eat those, the birds, the salamanders, are negatively affected, and instead they eat jumping worms. That's what they've got left to eat. But jumping worms are not a great food source for a number of reasons. You may have noticed that they have huge boom and bust cycles. So they reproduce really quickly. They have a huge biomass in middle to late summer, and then they disappear. Whereas a lot of the other soil animal community, there's enough of them that they're always present in some capacity. Again, jumping worms are not that nutritious compared to things like caterpillars that other vertebrates might eat. And in some places where the soil is contaminated with metal, jumping worms, and in fact, most earthworms, will have high metal concentrations that are enough to see bioaccumulation happen. So what we call this is an ecological trap, where you think jumping worms could be good because they're feeding the bird, they're feeding the salamanders potentially when they're smaller, but it's actually, it's a trap. What I see with jumping worms in more urban spaces is grass gets really hard hit, turf grass. And so soccer fields and golf courses, and you'll see this is kind of along a path where you have jumping worms. You'll see these castings start to pile up right near the path. This has consequences. The castings, so the poop, those granules, when they erode, they clog up stormwater drains, agricultural drains. And one thing that we are looking at in the Catskills, so the drinking water for New York City, is what that means when you have all of these casting and sediment and nutrients coming into the drinking water. And of course, since we're in Connecticut, we love our stone fences. If you like stone fences, if you like New England forests, maybe some of you already know this YouTube channel, Tom Wessel's, very, very cool stuff. And what I learned from that is that New England has about 125,000 miles of stone fences, so enough to wrap around the globe 5 times. If you get enough jumping worms, a long enough infestation, and the castings start to build up, these fences tend to sort of topple over. And this is what's going on just outside my house. All right, third part, how do jumping worms spread? I do this in a number of places, but one really good place to look at this is New York City. It's a huge hub of transportation, and as an invasive species biologist, it's a great place to work because they've got all the newest, hottest invasions, and it's kind of a natural experiment because it's in different places. So the chestnut blight was discovered at the Bronx Zoo in 1905 and pretty rapidly knocked out effectively the American chestnut from the North American forests. And the other thing that the Bronx Zoo is famous for is importing jumping worms in 1948. We can't totally blame them. They've certainly been imported tens, hundreds, thousands of times. But this is one of the earliest confirmed sightings of jumping worms in North America. So here's a little timeline to help you think about why or how jumping worms move. I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to tell you some stories and you're going to have to draw the dots together. So in 1948, the jumping worms are brought to the Bronx Zoo to feed the platypuses in the platypus exhibit. There's like a long spread in Life magazine all about it. In the 1980s, they were identified in New York City in natural areas. It took them a long time to get into the woods. When New York City Natural Areas Conservancy did that study of all of the boroughs, they noted about 12% of the plots were invaded with jumping worms. When I went back and resurveyed that in 2018, 19, 2020, that 12% had jumped to 64% of the plots that we had. And so it seems like there's something really important that's gone on between 2013 and 2019. And we don't know for sure at all. But one hypothesis that I kind of like is that there were a series of hurricanes right around 2013, including Hurricane Sandy. And a ton of trees were down. New York City was just a mess. And so these trees, as they were sawed up, they were chipped and used for biofuel and landfill cover and mulch. And they took a lot of care to do best management practices for all of the invasive species that they were familiar with then, like Asian longhorn beetle, but jumping worms were just not on the radar. So all of these trees were chipped and piled up in one big mulch pile that was then distributed out to all of the different parks and natural areas to be used as trail mulch. And so that probably left you a little bit depressed, but I want to give you a few hopeful pieces throughout this. So right next to the Bronx Zoo is the Thane family forest. It's attached to the botanical gardens. And so this is right near where jumping worms were discovered early on, and they've been in that area for a while, but they're not in this forest. They're kind of on the edges of it in some places, but for the most part, you would expect this to be totally overrun with jumping worms. But in fact, they have a deep organic horizon, a lot of things in the understory, and very few jumping worms. They do a few things that are unique that you should be trying to think about, maybe on your own properties or on, places that you work and play. Potentially seeing which of these you can incorporate. So these are the things that they've done. I don't know which is the best one, but I'll go through them. So it's never been logged. It's old growth. So that's one thing. They also make their own mulch, so they don't bring anything in from outside. They chip the trees right there and use that mulch on the property. They also propagate the plants on site, so they're not bringing in a bunch of seedlings from everywhere. And they tend to plant bare root as much as possible. And then finally, they exclude deer from the area. And so I looked at a bunch of different ways in the other parks and natural areas that jumping worms might be spread. And one of the main things that came up was actually not movement. Were not really all of these other things. They were potentially, but the two main ones were moving of mulch and moving of soil, and especially mulch here. So mulched areas tended to have much higher jumping worm densities. So that's one hypothesis for why jumping worms have exploded. But of course, it's not just New York City that's seen an explosion of jumping worms. It's been all throughout the sort of southern New England area. So there's probably other things like high moisture years, or just having a big enough population that you, enough propagule pressure, a big enough population that a lot of them come through. Okay. I did peek at the chat. I don't know if that's allowed, but somebody asked how bare root planting prevents jumping worms. So the key thing there is that then you're not moving soil. So you're just planting the roots. You're just planting the plant directly. And jumping worm cocoons, the eggs are big enough that you can see them with the naked eye. So if you're not planting a big clump of soil in there, it's just the roots, then you're not moving jumping worms. Okay. All right, and I will push on to part 4 with that. Okay, so another hopeful bit. Not all invasions are the same. Not all invasions proceed as quickly as others. And so I think of them on this continuum, with chestnut blight being over here. And once chestnut blight was here in North America, there was not a lot that could be done. It was spread with the wind and it knocked out the trees very, very quickly. Emerald ash borer, that spread quite a bit more because we were moving firewood. So as people stopped moving wood very long distances, that certainly slowed the movement of the ash borer. Jumping worms, as you saw in the Thane family forest Bronx Zoo example, they are like so closely tied to what we do and us moving them. They have ways of getting around too, but that tends to be quite local. So I think of them along this continuum of the importance of human-mediated transport. So over here, it doesn't really matter if we change our behavior that much. Chestnut blight's still going to get everywhere, but over here with jumping worms, there's some fairly simple, some complicated things that we can do. And another hint that this might be the case is, I'm going to pop this map up again that we looked at the beginning. So if you remember the dark gray, and down here in the south, this is where jumping worms could be. And they could be way up here in Labrador or Hudson's Bay. The cold doesn't knock them back. What do you think is the reason that they haven't gotten into Canada until really this year? I'm going to let you think about that for a second. You can put it in the chat or in the Q&A if you want to. So remember, it's not the cold, because they could survive. They're fine with the cold. What it is, probably, is the fact that it's so hard to move soil and mulch products across the border. So 2 hints that our behavior, changes to our behavior, specifically soil and mulch. Some of these other things are a little bit, have some impacts on it too, but these are the key 2 things to focus on to not spread them. One thing that you can do is log any instances that you see of jumping worms. So iNaturalist and IMAP Invasives, I use those 2 quite a bit. They're apps on the phone. And then EdMaps is another one that's available all throughout the country that people out west especially use. So a few other things that you can do to slow or stop or prevent the spread and impacts of jumping worms. So they can get into bait. They're pretty hard to identify. If you buy bait, they're supposed to be night crawlers, but jumping worms can get in there. So if you're going somewhere remote, don't bring any worms as bait. But if you're fishing around here, take a peek and make sure there's nobody that's moving especially fast in the container. And don't let them out into the wild, whatever you have left. So planting bare root, we talked about this a little bit, but jumping worm cocoons are visible to the naked eye. And I don't have a picture in this presentation. I should have done that, but they are going to send around a homeowner's guide that's the step-by-step list of these things. And that has a picture of the size of the cocoons. So you can, wash the roots sufficiently. So even if you don't have bare root plants, you have plants in soil, you can rinse them. Just take care of how you're disposing and washing the debris off of them. Don't dump that water out into the woods. Strain it, throw away the solids in the strainer, and then you can dump the fresh water. If you're buying especially perennials, or planting perennials, you can just pop them out of the pot and take a look at the soil. So without jumping worms, you'll see them regular soil or potting mix, things like that. And then if you have jumping worms, you'll see these castings right there on the top of the soil. So this is not something you want to plant into your property. Red wigglers, that's what you want for your compost. Jumping worms are not very good for your compost. Yard waste can be infested with jumping worms if there's a little bit of soil attached to something. So not dumping this into natural areas, keeping it on your property. Currently, there's no regulation of jumping worms in Connecticut, but New York State recently included them in their list of prohibited invasive animals to sell. So this has never happened as far as my knowledge goes. But for the general public, you get a warning first, and then a fine after that for spreading them. Nurseries, in theory, if they continue to knowingly spread jumping worms and sell jumping worms, contaminated plants could potentially lose their license and business certification. But of course, this hasn't happened yet. You have to do it knowingly, and there are things that you can do to not sell them. But the policy is starting to catch up with this. So it's something that people really need to be thinking about. For nurseries and garden centers, I think the best thing is having your local garden center, your small businesses, your relationship with those people, and tell them that you care about this and that you want them to prioritize prevention. If you already have them on your property, and you want to know what you can plant, or if you're doing any restoration efforts in your area, there's a few things that you can think about. So deep-rooted species tend to do the best. So this can either be choosing bigger things to transplant, so older trees, not little tiny seedlings, or species that have deep roots. And a lot of the native prairie pollinator gardens, a lot of these species do have very deep roots. So they have the added benefit, not just for the pollinators, not just for the ecosystem services, but they can also withstand jumping worms because of their deep roots. So on the other side of things, you either go the super deep roots or the things that don't really need to do a whole lot of rooting at all. So native ground covers and stoloniferous plants that can cruise along the soil can do quite well. And then experimenting with native plants that you think might have unique adaptations. So we just found these by planting out a bunch of species and seeing how they responded to jumping worms. Logging and landscaping. So in a lot of commercial logging and landscaping will have clean vehicle permits. So making sure that between sites, they just power wash these wheels so that you're not moving all of that soil from site to site. And that's something you can put into your contracts. Being careful about buying mulch, topsoil, and compost. So this is hard because so many people get their mulch from big community piles of mulch. And I would say, if you don't want jumping worms, don't get your mulch from there. So get your mulch from other places. So one thing you could do is either get commercial mulch that's been heat treated or solarized in a plastic bag for either 140 degrees for a short time, or this lower, more sort of feasible temperature for a home gardener to get a 104 Fahrenheit for 3 days. And that's enough to kill any worms or any eggs. So anything you can do to bring the soil that comes in, the mulch to come in, it's been heat treated. And a lot of commercial mulch is, but what you need to make sure that it wasn't heat treated and then put back into the ground to be reinfested with jumping worms. But thinking about that way that the mulch gets from the tree to your yard and making sure that there's as few steps to there as possible. So one thing that you can do, if you ever see the electrical company contractors going around cutting trees from below the power lines, they will happily drop that mulch off to you because they have to pay to get rid of it. So you flag them down and say, hey, that mulch that you collected from the tree on my street, it's just been from tree to truck. I would like that piled up, please. And they're usually quite happy to do that. And also with compost, thinking about the supply chain, and if you can do it on your own property or as local as possible, that tends to be a good way of making sure that you don't have jumping worms, as long as you don't already have them. So learning to recognize the signs. I flashed these pictures up quite a few times. This has been on purpose. Repetition, that this is what you're looking for, these crumbly castings, granulated soil. So uninvaded soil, if you dig a little hole into it, is the profile looking at the hole that you've dug. So no earthworms. Remember, there's this duff, there's lots of roots, there's lots of fungi, and there's distinct layers. With the lumbricid earthworms, you get kind of homogeneous, mixed up garden type soil. And then with jumping worms, you get very gravelly looking soil. So these are the three different things that you could see. Right now, jumping worms are small, starting to hatch. They won't look big like this, but in the summer, this is what you can look for. So they're about the same length, 20 centimeters or so at maturity. But they have some, and they're both pretty darkly pigmented, but they have some different features. So the most obvious one is that behavior that I showed you. No, I didn't show you. You can look it up on the internet. The jumping worms really do thrash, and then they skate away on top of the soil like a snake. And the lumbricid earthworms, they sort of expand and contract their body to slowly move along the soil. And they also have these, what we call a beaver tail, a slightly flattened tail to push themselves along. You can also think about the pigmentation. So jumping worms are pretty pigmented all the way through, pretty dark, purple, metallic sheen on them. Whereas the lumbricid species, the nightcrawlers, they have a dark head but a light tail. Because they live in deep, deep burrows, and the tail tends to stay in the soil and the head comes up. So it needs to be protected from UV. So that's why it's pigmented. Another thing to think about is the position of this clitellum here. In jumping worms, it's quite close to the head, within the first 10% of the body. And the color can vary from white, pink, gray, but it tends to be kind of a mother of pearl, like sheeny color or shine to it, versus the lumbricid earthworm. It tends to be grayish brown, similar to the color of the worm. It doesn't stand out quite so starkly from the rest of the color of the worm. And it's much closer to the middle of the body. So here you can see the clitellum is way down here in segment 30 plus versus the jumping worm much closer up. And this I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through because you'll have a copy of it if you want to look through. But this is a key that was intellectually put together by Joseph Gores at University of Vermont. I put together the map of it, but he did the thinking behind it to help you figure out what kind of species you have. But it's without looking at the genetics, it's hard to say for sure. But you could potentially get close to finding the species. So as I mentioned before, identifying jumping worm invasions, logging that into one of the platforms so that scientists and naturalists can see that. And then managing the things that you can. So one other thing that we didn't really talk about too much from the Thane family forest is that they also fence out deer. So they do have big reproductive, flowering, fruiting native plants. So anything you can do to sort of fence or protect any, or take up deer hunting, take up bow hunting, any of that to reduce the deer browse pressure on a lot of plants. And so I said the spoiler, which is that it's very hard to get rid of jumping worms once you have them, but there is some work going on to think about ways to potentially manage them that you can follow. So University of Wisconsin, UMass Amherst has folks working on a chemical treatment, saponin. So that is the frothy chemical that boils up when you cook quinoa. So it's a seed, it's a component from seeds. So it's from a natural source, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have other consequences to waterways, to this callback to the beginning, these native earthworms that we have in low abundance that we know very, very little about. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into making sure that any of those chemical controls are not having non-target effects. And similarly, some fungal biocontrol on the jumping worms is something that's being looked at. But again, lots of other possible things that could be impacted on it. So these are not probably coming all that soon. A lot of work needs to be done. There's a great Facebook page, the Jumping Worm Observation Discussion and Support Group, where people share a lot of the research. There's been no research that I have seen from the academic world that hasn't also appeared on that page for the most part. And people help each other read it, and it's kind of cool to see. So I'll say a quick thanks to partners and funding partners. And I think I'm pretty well close to time, and we can start doing questions, I think.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Annise. That's so much information to try to pull together all at once. We have questions in the chat and Q&A, and I have some questions. And you did tell us too that they are called jumping worms because they really do seem to jump. Is that a pretty good diagnostic point if we see it jumping?
So that is a good diagnostic point in the summer, if you see the worm itself. But if you see that soil texture, that crumbly soil, that's a really good indicator, because the worms appear and disappear. Rainy days, they come out. Hot days, they go away sometimes. And so the soil is really, really a key thing to look for. And finding the jumping worms is kind of secondary. But yeah, if they do sort of thrash around,
okay.
Yeah,
someone wants to know, if we see them, is it any help to kill them? Does that help reduce them, or do they just reproduce so ferociously that doesn't help?
I have not heard of any studies that have done that, and I have heard mixed anecdotal reviews from people that have tried it, that have done back-breaking efforts to try and get rid of them. And I have not heard anybody confidently declare that they are making a big dent in the population. So that was a long way of saying probably not.
Okay, so it's not worth going out and pouring whatever it was, the hot
Mustard,
mustard or yeah. Okay.
Now it's a different story if you're talking about raised beds, if you're talking about a small garden, if you're talking about planters or something like that. then you could potentially have some impact. But if you've got like a big natural area, you need a lot of mustard.
Okay. If you have them in your soil and you have raised beds, are your raised beds safe, or how do they travel and how far do they can they climb?
They can climb. Yeah, yeah. So devising some method to keep them out would be key. So they can climb straight up, but they can't climb like up something that's really, really angled. So like if you've got tables that you have plants on, for example, you can, if you've ever seen those little funnels against squirrels for bird feeders that are go around the legs of tables and things like that. Screening under jumping beds that's quite fine could potentially stop them. I'm not saying that one worm won't climb up, because I've seen them climb. I've seen pictures of them climb, but that will certainly keep the population down, I would say.
How quickly do they spread? If you have them on one side, let's say you've got a quarter acre yard or half acre. If you've got them on one side, how long does it take till you have them pretty much in your whole yard? Do you have any sense of that?
Okay, so what people say is 30 meters a year.
Wow.
However, I will answer it with a story. So I had a yard waste dump site that the community was dumping the yard waste into the natural area, and there were jumping worms in that pile. So I knew that they were there, and I decided to test their movement. So I set up a grid 200 meters, expecting to see this 30 meter thing. And I studied it 4 years. They didn't move out of the compost pile. And in the 5th year, I found them beyond the 200 meters. Wow. So I think that you're not going to get a rate that's really reliable. I think that they just 1 year will just go everywhere, and then sort of they'll expand and contract and expand and contract. And so I don't think that you'll necessarily get them if someone in your town has them. If you remember the Bronx Zoo, the Thane Family Forest right next door. If you do some of those practices to not bring in mulch, to not bring in soil.
The list of things that the Thane property did was really interesting. Were they doing those already, or did they start those specifically to counteract the jumping worms?
Nope. They did that. They did that from their own prerogative. I don't know why they did, but they only started thinking about jumping worms this year. And I couldn't quite believe it. I went and I looked. Wow. I did a lap, and tons of organic matter.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Well, Marion wants to know, if you have jumping worms in your garden and the soil is damaged, does it help to add compost to improve your soil?
That is the question, isn't it? And short answer is we don't know. There is research going on coming out of SUNY ESF. There's a master's student that's testing a number of different amendments to see if he can answer that. But you have to complete that sentence. So is it helpful? Isn't a good enough sentence. You have to say helpful for what? So if you do want to be growing plants, but you don't mind also feeding the worm population that's maybe going to get into the woods and going to expand, then feeding the soil is good. If you want to try and stop the worms at all costs, then starving the soil could be good. But neither, yeah. So.
Oh, wow, that's a tough one.
It is a yet unanswered question, as far as I know.
A lot of our group works in one natural area, may go to another, may go from there to going home. We know our beloved Cold Spring Park. We saw some there, the city's largest park. We saw some there at the end of last summer. So what do we do when we leave the park and go home? Do we wash our boots off or what?
Right. So we're coming out of COVID and people are thinking about like moving microscopic things and decontaminating, but you don't have to do that with jumping worms. You don't need to bleach things. You don't need to disinfect things. The key thing is that you don't want to move chunks of soil or chunks of mulch. So if you're just walking, maybe you check your boot treads, you look down and make sure that they don't have a bunch of mud in them. And if they do, you knock it off before you hop in your car to go home.
Okay, that's manageable.
Yes. Yes.
Uh, Barbara wants to know, do they have a natural enemy that eats them where they're native?
Yeah, they do. And they do here too. So birds eat them. They don't eat a ton of them. They're very scary as they move. They spit out some liquid toxic.
Really?
Yeah. They can drop their tail. They have all sorts of things to make things not want to eat them, but things still eat them. So lots of birds eat them. For example, they've got tons of parasites here. That's actually another way to identify them is right around the clitellum. They've got these weird looking parasites. And there are also, if you've heard about another invasive worm, the hammerhead worm.
There was just an article about that today.
Yeah, they're very cool. They're very cool. They glide up to the worm and then they glue themselves to it and then digest the worm through its skin.
Whoa. Whoa.
Right. So there are definitely there are things eating them here. There are things eating them at home. I think there are many ways that things become invasive. And the one that people always think of first is predators and lack of predators. But things aren't just interacting with their predators. They're competing. They are, there's all sorts of other reasons that things can become invasive other than lack of predators.
Okay. We have a question. After washing the roots of new plants, how do you dispose of the soil residue?
Okay, so there's a great visual that I wanted to send along, but it's through Cornell Cooperative Extension, but it's not quite finished yet. And so I will send that along when it comes out. But essentially what you need to do is you've got your bucket that you've rinsed the roots in, and then that's kind of a slurry. And then you want to strain that through a pretty fine sieved thing, like a rice sieve, not a pasta strainer. That's too big. Something smaller, like for rice, things like that. And then that water will not have any eggs in it. So you can dump the water, and then the solids you can just bag up and then either heat it, freeze it, or just throw it into the trash.
Wow. I'm going to be saving money on plants this year. That's a big process to go through.
Yeah. Or, germinate things from scratch, or go to places that don't have jumping worms.
Have you found that nurseries are pretty honest when asked whether they have them?
I think that nurseries are very keen to get ahead of the problem, because I think that the word has spread quickly that this is something that customers care about. And so they are they're very keen to prevent it. The harder thing, and this is big in New England, is the mulch industry, because things that they have to do to prevent jumping worms are much more expensive and time consuming and space consuming. So I haven't actually talked with too many people yet in the mulch industry, but I think that's going to be the one that we have to get a little creative and co-create solutions with.
Okay, maybe a little.
But I think I think that people like all of you coming to people that you are already customers of and saying, this is something I care about, I would pay more for this if you can put in the extra effort to make sure that it's not happening, will be so much more effective than regulatory agencies coming in and checking to see if there's jumping worms and penalizing people. That's a really, really hard thing to do.
Yep, a very good point. David would like to know, can jumping worms be imported in composted manure?
Definitely. Yeah. So that's one where solarizing to heat it up with those 104 for 3 days or 140 for um, that one's in the homeowner's manual. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but that's in the other document that I'll send around.
Terrific. Thank you. We already have jumping worms on our property and properties adjacent to us. How do I mitigate, control them in my compost piles that we use to amend our gardens?
Oh, okay. Okay. So amending the compost. So that's going to be a smaller area. So as you take the compost out, can you, on the way from the compost to the garden, put it in a black plastic bag and leave it out in the sun? Or if you have a greenhouse or a hot area that you're pretty sure will go over 100 Fahrenheit for an extended period of time between the compost and the garden, then that can be a good strategy.
Okay. Oh, Carolyn has a great question. Once the worms have eaten all the nutrients in a spot of land, do they move on or can they live in one place for a long time?
This is why jumping worms are so impressive. And I think the main reason why they're so invasive. Typically, we have this thing in, thinking about in ecology where things reach a carrying capacity, right? So they use up some nutrient and then the nutrient runs out and then they start to plateau and go down. Yeah. Jumping worms are ecosystem engineers. And what that means and what they do better than anything I've ever seen is they engineer the soil to be perfect for themselves. So those castings, that deep casting layer is so disruptive for everything else, for roots, for salamanders, for everything beyond that. But it's perfect for them because if it's too hot, they can easily go down. And if it's too cold, they can go down. And if it's too dry, then they can go down and they can easily come down and move around. And so the constraints that would normally be on them, they just engineer out and engineer out. And they have a lot of diet flexibility. So some things, can only eat microbes or something like that. But jumping worms can eat those, they can eat leaves, they can eat fungi, they can eat a whole swath of different things. So they are quite amazing in their ability to engineer their own habitat.
They're monsters.
Like humans.
Yeah. Oh, terrible comparison, but true. So you talked about their density being much greater. What is the density, the average density of them in the soil?
I have a picture of sort of a high density, what you might see in a high density area. Yeah, so something like this here, and then it can maybe get up to like 3 times that dense.
Wow.
So they're piled right up on top of each other.
Wow. And so they're okay with the competition from each other.
They do seem to be okay with the competition from each other. And one thing that has never been tested experimentally, as far as I know, but keeps popping up as something that people notice, is that they outcompete the lumbricid earthworms, the European ones that are already here. But they don't really outcompete themselves.
It's amazing. Well, we have time for 2 more questions here. So we have one question that says, regarding the low number of species, the diversity that drops down of invasive plants. This person wants to know, doesn't that tend to happen anyway? So how do you know to weigh out what's the responsibility of the jumping worms versus what's just the natural curve for lack of diversity?
Do they mean?
Here, I may not have explained it well. Let me read it. Regarding low number of species of invasive plants in the jumping worm invaded sites, isn't that the nature of an invasive species, that it takes over the site even to the exclusion of the other invasives?
Yes, definitely. definitely. But it's what that plot was showing is that if you have jumping worms, you just have fewer plants, invasive plants or otherwise. So yes, exactly. They're potentially promoting a monoculture of one invasive plant. Which tends to be more problematic than a whole diversity of invasive plants.
Yep. And our final question is, do other wildlife besides deer spread jumping worms, like rabbits, squirrels, and chipmunks?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has studied that. It is very possible. Someone asked me this. I was giving a talk last Saturday, and they said, what about a bird that picks up the worm by the tail, and then it's flying, and then the worm drops its tail because it's at a predator, and then the worm drops down? Okay, yeah, that in theory. But I just think that the mulch and the soil thing is like so huge that a little thing that a bird here and there is doing is probably not big. One other thing that I actually forgot to mention is that so one of my collaborators, Joseph Gores, has this hypothesis that they create this really erodible riverbank, and that their cocoons fall into the river and then get spread through the water also.
Oh my goodness. If we had more time, I'd love to know about their effect on drinking water, but we'll have to save that for another one. Thank you.
That study is ongoing, so I don't have an answer for that yet. So we're working out the techniques on that.
Okay, good. That's another time. Thank you. This was just amazing, Annise. Thank you so much. We have a lot to think about. And thank you, Annise. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.